Imagine waking up from, like, a deep, totally dreamless sleep.
Right, you're just completely out cold.
Exactly. And your eyes just snap open in the dark. Almost instantly, your heart is it's pounding at, I don't know, 150 beats a minute, hammering against your ribs like it's trying to escape.
Oh, yeah, and you can't catch your breath.
Right. You have this cold, prickling numbness spreading down your arms and into your fingers, and the room around you suddenly feels completely unreal, like you're trapped behind glass or something.
Beasts, too.
You are
Oh, really?
absolutely, entirely convinced that you are having a massive heart attack and that you are about to die right there. But your heart is physically fine.
Completely healthy, yeah.
So today we are tracing a century-long medical mystery to explore that exact scenario. We're going to look at how a condition that used to be dismissed as, well, soldier's heart, led scientists to discover a rogue biological alarm system hidden deep inside our own brains.
Yeah, we are really diving into the physiological terror of the panic attack today. I mean, it is one of the most intense, misunderstood, and physically overwhelming experiences a human being can actually endure.
Oh, absolutely.
And for a really long time, psychiatry just sort of struggled to categorize it. It lived in this murky diagnostic territory where it was often brushed off as just a severe case of nerves or background anxiety.
Which is exactly why we need to strip away the colloquialisms and the stigma today in this deep dive. We're looking at a huge stack of clinical documents covering the current DSM-5 criteria, the psychiatric history of how we learn to even categorize this, and some truly astonishing physiological research.
The science on it is just wild.
It really is. And the goal is to understand the panic attack, not just as this vague psychological event, but as a mechanical, deeply physical cascade.
Right.
And to do that, we kind of have to look at the fault line and how we even define it. Because the DSM-5 criteria describe a very, very specific physical reality.
They do. The whole definition really hinges on abruptness. The DSM-5 describes a panic attack as this sudden surge of intense fear or discomfort that reaches a peak within minutes.
So not a slow build.
No, exactly. It's an explosion. And to qualify clinically, you have to hit at least 4 out of 13 specific physical and cognitive symptoms. So we are talking about the classics: accelerated heart rate, shortness of breath, trembling, chest pain.
Right, the things people usually associate with it.
Yeah, but there are also these lesser-known, highly specific markers like paresthesia.
Yes. Paresthesia is that terrifying numbness or tingling, usually in the hands or the feet or even the lips, and we'll get into the actual chemistry of why that happens later because it's fascinating.
It really is.
But alongside the physical stuff, the cognitive symptoms are just as severe. There's derealization, which is this profound feeling that the world around you is suddenly fake or somehow distorted.
Like you're in a movie or something.
Right. And depersonalization, feeling completely detached from your own body. And all of this culminates in a literal, overwhelming fear of losing control, going crazy, or just dying right there on the spot.
But here's the really interesting thing. Despite how precise and severe that symptom list is, the DSM-5 actually does not consider a panic attack to be a standalone mental disorder.
Yeah, that distinction really stood out in the source material for me. It functions a lot more like a car's check engine light.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right, because the clinical term used here is a symptom specifier. If your check engine light comes on, it doesn't tell you exactly what broke. It just tells you the engine is overwhelmed.
Exactly.
So a panic attack can flash on the dashboard for someone dealing with PTSD or specific phobia or major depression. The attack is the flashing light, not the underlying engine failure.
That is a perfect way to capture the clinical boundary, because the threshold for that flashing light to become its own standalone diagnosis, which is what we call panic disorder, is actually extremely strict.
What's the tipping point?
Well, to cross that line, the attacks must be recurrent. And crucially, they have to be unexpected. They have to come completely out of the blue.
Ah, so not just triggered by, like, seeing a spider if you have arachnophobia.
Right, exactly. They aren't triggered by a specific predictable fear like stepping onto an airplane or public speaking. They just happen.
And beyond just having those unexpected attacks, the diagnosis requires the aftermath to fundamentally alter your life, right?
Yes, that's the second piece. You have to experience at least a month of intense, persistent worry about when the next attack will strike, or you have to make significant behavioral changes to avoid them.
Like totally changing your daily commute just to avoid a highway where you once had an attack.
Exactly. The disorder is the combination of the rogue alarm system going off and the long shadow of fear it casts over your daily routine.
It's just wild to think about. But getting to this level of diagnostic precision, I mean, that wasn't quick, was it?
Oh, not at all. It took the medical community over a century of observation and, honestly, miscategorization to finally map this out. If you trace the historical context back, the earliest robust observations of these symptoms actually come from the battlefields of the American Civil War.
The famous soldier's heart.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So in 1871, a physician named Jacob Mendes da Costa started documenting soldiers returning from combat, and they had severe breathlessness, chest pain, palpitations, and just profound physical exhaustion.
Right, and he's looking at this through the lens of 1870s medicine.
Exactly. So he's using the tools of his era. He's listening to their chests, checking them for cardiovascular disease, and he found absolutely nothing mechanically wrong with their hearts.
Wow. The valves were fine, the resting rhythm was fine.
Completely fine. So they called it da Costa syndrome, or soldier's heart, just assuming it was some mysterious cardiac overexertion. And we saw the exact same phenomenon pop up again during World War I.
Right, the sources said they called it effort syndrome then.
Yeah. These doctors were essentially trying to put a name to something that mechanically mimicked a failing heart, but left no structural damage.
Because they just didn't have the neurological framework to see it any other way. They were describing the physical fallout of an overwhelmed nervous system.
Exactly. And the shift from a cardiac explanation to a psychological one didn't really start until Sigmund Freud in 1895.
Right, Freud, which is always an interesting turn in medical history.
Always. But he published this paper arguing that these sudden, explosive attacks of acute anxiety, the racing heart, the sweating, the terror, were an entirely different phenomenon from just chronic generalized nervous exhaustion.
I mean, his underlying mechanism for this was, what, dammed up sexual libido.
Yeah, which the clinical literature today wholly and completely dismisses. That theory is totally a relic of its time.
But the descriptive move he made was actually really crucial, right?
Very crucial. He drew a definitive line in the sand, separating a sudden acute attack from the general day-to-day background hum of chronic worry. He realized they were just different shapes of suffering.
Right. But the true turning point, like the moment this transitioned from a vague psychological concept to a concrete biological reality, that didn't happen until the 1960s.
Yeah, with a psychiatrist named Donald F. Klein. His work at Hillside Hospital in New York basically birthed the modern biological understanding of panic.
Okay, so break down what Klein actually did.
So he was treating hospitalized patients who suffered from this really tangled mix of both spontaneous panic episodes and constant daily generalized anxiety. And Klein decided to give them a medication called imipramine.
Which is an early antidepressant, right?
But tricyclic. Right. Yes.
Yeah.
And instead of just sedating the patient like older tranquilizers would, a drug like imipramine actually alters the balance of neurotransmitters, specifically serotonin and norepinephrine in the brain's communication pathways.
And the result of that was, well, completely unexpected based on the source material.
Totally. Klein observed that the imipramine entirely eradicated the sudden spontaneous panic attacks. They just stopped happening. But, and this is the key, the drug did absolutely nothing for the patient's daily background generalized anxiety.
Wait, so let me get this straight. The background worry was completely untouched, but the explosive panic attacks were essentially cured.
Exactly. And Klein used this logical framework called drug dissection, which makes perfect sense once you hear it. If you introduce a single chemical compound and it selectively shuts down one form of anxiety while completely ignoring another,
then those two experiences cannot be driven by the same biological machinery.
Bingo! They must be running on entirely separate neurological hardware, even if they feel vaguely similar to the person having them.
That is brilliant. The drug dissection proved that panic isn't just a more intense version of generalized anxiety. It's not just the anxiety dial turned up to an 11.
No, it's a completely different mechanism.
It's kind of like a completely different weather system. Like, generalized anxiety is a long, bleak, overcast winter. But a panic attack is a sudden, violent tornado touching down without warning. They're both weather, sure, but they run on entirely different atmospheric physics.
I love that. And that biological distinction was so undeniable that it directly shaped the creation of the DSM-3 in 1980. It officially split panic disorder into its own distinct category.
And Klein later expanded on this too, right? With the suffocation false alarm hypothesis.
Yeah, he proposed that people with panic disorder have a hypersensitive internal carbon dioxide monitor. And this monitor misfires, aggressively signaling to the brain that the body is suffocating, even when the oxygen in the room is perfectly normal.
Okay, so if Klein proved that this tornado is a distinct biological event, it kind of forces us to ask, what does that unique biological footprint actually look like when we scan the body?
It's quite a chain reaction.
Right. Let's look at the raw anatomy of a false alarm. From first principles, the sources say it starts deep in the brain's primitive threat detection center, the amygdala.
Right. So the amygdala functions as, well, basically the brain's smoke detector. In a panic attack, this smoke detector triggers a massive alarm, operating under the assumption that a lethal immediate threat is right in front of you.
And what makes this so impossible to just ignore is that the amygdala's signal literally bypasses the prefrontal cortex, the logical reasoning part of your brain.
Exactly. That is why you cannot simply think your way out of a panic attack in those first few seconds.
Yeah.
The logical brain is effectively locked out of the command center.
Wow. So once that alarm sounds, the amygdala signals the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus acts as this central dispatcher, initiating a massive chemical cascade down two main pathways.
First, it triggers the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So the hypothalamus sends a chemical messenger to the pituitary gland,
Right.
which then sends a signal all the way down to the adrenal glands sitting right on top of your kidneys. And it commands them to just flood the bloodstream with cortisol, which is a primary stress hormone.
And simultaneously, the hypothalamus activates the sympathetic nervous system. And this is largely driven by a structure in the brainstem called the locus coeruleus, right?
Yes, which basically acts as a central pump for noradrenaline.
And the speed of this sympathetic surge is just staggering. I mean, within seconds, your body deploys the ultimate fight or flight package.
It really does. Adrenaline hits the bloodstream. Your heart rate violently accelerates to pump oxygenated blood to your large muscle groups so you can run or fight.
Your pupils dilate to let in more light, so you have sharper peripheral vision.
Yep. And your digestive system completely shuts down because, digesting lunch is a waste of energy if you are about to be eaten by a bear.
Right. It is a perfectly engineered survival mechanism.
Right.
But in a panic attack, there is no bear. You might just be, like, waiting in line at the grocery store. The body is screaming fire, but there is no smoke.
And because there's no external threat to physically fight or run away from, this massive physiological mobilization actually starts to work against the body.
Which brings us to a really fundamental piece of the puzzle here, the carbon dioxide loop.
The CO2 loop is crucial.
It's fascinating because it explains almost all the most terrifying physical symptoms. So when the fight or flight response kicks in, you naturally start breathing faster or hyperventilating to pull in more oxygen for this impending physical struggle.
Right. But since you aren't actually burning that oxygen by sprinting away from a predator, you end up exhaling and blowing off carbon dioxide way faster than your resting body can actually produce it.
And this rapid loss of CO2 drops the carbon dioxide levels in your blood, which in turn raises your blood pH.
Which, creates this physiological state called respiratory alkalosis.
And respiratory alkalosis triggers a literal mechanical domino effect. The source material highlights that low CO2 levels in the blood directly cause cerebral vasoconstriction.
Yes, meaning the blood vessels in your brain actually physically narrow, which temporarily restricts blood flow to the brain tissue itself.
That is wild. And that slight reduction in cerebral blood flow is exactly what causes the intense dizziness.
It is the direct cause of paresthesia, that numbness and tingling in your hands and feet.
Right. And perhaps most distressing, it is the root mechanical cause of derealization, that terrifying sensation that you or the world around you are just no longer real.
It's a tragic irony, really.
Yep.
You are standing in the grocery store, you feel intensely dizzy, your hands go numb, reality feels distant, and your immediate logical thought is, I am having a stroke, or I'm losing my mind.
But you aren't. Those sensations are just the predictable mechanical results of low carbon dioxide caused by how you are breathing. It's basic chemistry. It's not impending doom.
Exactly. And that chemical predictability is so absolute that researchers in the 1960s realized they didn't even need to wait for a panic attack to happen organically in the wild.
Right, they could just artificially manufacture one on demand in a laboratory.
Which is exactly what they did.
This brings us to the provocation studies, which are honestly incredible to read about. In 1967, two researchers, Pitts and McClure, took patients who had a known history of panic disorder and gave them an intravenous infusion of a chemical called sodium lactate.
And it worked. The infusion reliably induced a full-blown panic attack right there in the clinical setting.
And later studies took a different approach, targeting that respiratory mechanism we were just talking about.
Right. Researchers had susceptible individuals breathe a specific gas mixture that contained 35% carbon dioxide. To put that in perspective, the ambient air you and I breathe normally contains about 20.04% carbon dioxide.
So they just massively spiked the CO2 concentration.
Massively. And in individuals vulnerable to panic disorder, inhaling this gas reliably and immediately triggered an acute panic attack. Their bodies registered the spike in CO2 as a suffocating threat and just tripped the alarm.
But wait, when they gave that same 35% CO2 mixture to control people without panic disorder, it just caused mild discomfort? It didn't trigger a panic cascade?
Right, it was totally different for the control group.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here based on those studies. If a scientist can trigger the exact terror, the racing heart, the absolute conviction of impending doom just by turning a gas valve on a tank of CO2, doesn't that firmly establish this as a 100% biological hardware malfunction?
It certainly looks that way.
And if it's purely chemistry, doesn't that render psychological interventions like talk therapy just completely useless?
Well, that is the exact tension that drove psychiatric debate for decades. But before we get to the therapy part, there is actually another piece of clinical evidence that strongly bolsters the biological argument you're making: nocturnal panic attacks.
Oh, right. The midnight terrors.
Yeah. Approximately a third of patients diagnosed with panic disorder experience attacks that jolt them awake from a dead sleep. And clinical sleep studies show these attacks do not occur during REM sleep, which is when we dream or have nightmares.
So it's not a bad dream causing it.
No, they occur during deep, slow-wave, non-REM sleep. The patient wakes up already trapped in the physical grip of terror, heart pounding, gasping for air.
Wow. Which proves that a panic attack can initiate with absolutely zero conscious top-down cognitive trigger. There was no stressful thought, no phobia, no catastrophic worry. It is a bottom-up, brainstem-driven alarm going off in the dark.
Exactly. Which, again, reinforces the idea of pure biological determinism. But a guy named David M. Clark introduced a cognitive model in 1986 that completely flips that perspective.
Clark argued that biology isn't the final boss here.
Right. The initial alarm might be physical, but how our brain consciously interprets that alarm determines whether the fire burns out harmlessly or burns down the entire house.
Yes, the catastrophic misinterpretation of normal bodily sensations. It explains how biology and psychology form this devastating feedback loop. Let's use a relatable example for the listener.
Sure.
Imagine you climb a steep flight of stairs. When you reach the top landing, your heart is naturally beating faster from the exertion. If your nervous system is baseline calm, you just ignore it.
You don't even think twice.
Right. But if your system is primed for panic and acting as a hypervigilant security guard, you feel that flutter in your chest and you catastrophically misinterpret it. Your internal monologue screams, "My heart is racing. I am having a heart attack."
And the moment your brain genuinely believes a heart attack is occurring, it dumps real adrenaline into your bloodstream. That new surge of adrenaline forces your heart to beat even faster and harder.
Which the hypervigilant brain immediately uses as confirmation. Like, see, the pulse is faster now. The heart attack is definitely happening.
It locks the body into an escalating loop, spiraling from a completely normal physical sensation into a full-blown panic attack in just a matter of minutes.
The initial trigger might be a slight shift in CO2 or just a random palpitation, but the cognitive loop is what actually amplifies it into terror.
And that loop is exactly why cognitive behavioral therapy, specifically a technique called interoceptive exposure, is so remarkably effective. It disrupts the cycle by aggressively targeting that misinterpretation.
I have to say, interoceptive exposure sounds intensely uncomfortable on paper. The clinical documents describe therapists deliberately inducing the physical symptoms of a panic attack right there in the office.
Oh, it is definitely uncomfortable. They merge the biological triggers with psychological retraining. A therapist might have a patient spin rapidly in a swivel chair to induce profound dizziness.
Or they might instruct the patient to breathe exclusively through a thin coffee straw for a minute to induce a severe feeling of air hunger and suffocation.
Exactly. They intentionally recreate the precise physical sensations the patient fears the most.
But the goal isn't just to torture the patient, right? It's a process of experiential learning and habituation. You're forcing the brain's fear network to experience the dizziness or the shortness of breath in a controlled, safe environment over and over again.
Yeah, and eventually the synaptic link between the physical sensation and the catastrophic thought weakens. The brain finally learns a new rule. These physical sensations are incredibly uncomfortable, but they're absolutely not dangerous.
You are breaking the feedback loop. But outside of that controlled therapeutic environment, This catastrophic misinterpretation happens every single day with massive consequences for our healthcare system.
The real-world impact is huge, especially in emergency rooms.
The statistics on the ER toll are just staggering. The research indicates that roughly 25% of all emergency room patients presenting with severe chest pain who are eventually cleared of any cardiac event are actually suffering from panic disorder.
1 in 4.
1 in 4.
It places an enormous burden on medical resources because triage protocols demand that doctors rule out a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, before they can even consider a psychiatric or nervous system cause.
Because the physical presentation of panic mimics cardiac failure that closely.
It does, and the agony of that experience for the patient is profound. You have just survived what felt like a life-or-death physical crisis. You are rushed into the ER, hooked up to an EKG, blood is drawn, and then the attending doctor walks in and says, "Your heart is fine, you can go home. It's just anxiety."
Oh man, that phrase, just anxiety, often does immense psychological damage in these moments. It offers zero mechanical explanation for the very real physiological storm the patient just endured.
None at all. Invalidating that physical reality often deepens the patient's health anxiety, leaving them feeling crazy or misdiagnosed, which obviously directly fuels the fear of the next attack.
That is exactly why we need to clarify the neighborhood of terminology here, because precision really matters. For example, a panic attack is the physiological opposite of fainting.
Oh, that's a really important distinction.
Right, because fainting, which is medically known as vasovagal syncope, is caused by a sudden, drastic drop in heart rate and blood pressure, reducing blood to the brain. But a panic attack is a massive, explosive surge in heart rate and blood pressure.
So you are highly unlikely to faint during a panic attack because your blood pressure is physically elevated.
We also need to differentiate it from an anxiety attack, which is, a colloquial term, not a clinical one.
Right. Anxiety builds gradually over hours or days, usually tethered to a specific identifiable worry. Panic is an abrupt rogue alarm that peaks in minutes.
The clinical data also allows us to definitively bust some of the most pervasive myths. The first major myth, a panic attack can kill you.
That is false. There is absolutely no established medical mechanism by which the physiological cascade of a panic attack, acting entirely on its own, can cause death in an individual without a pre-existing severe cardiac or respiratory condition.
So the subjective conviction that you're dying is a recognized, documented symptom of the attack itself.
Exactly. The fear of death is entirely real to the brain, but the physical threat of death is an illusion.
The second major myth. People having a panic attack are being dramatic, or the symptoms are purely imaginary.
Also demonstrably false. The activation of the sympathetic nervous system during an attack is an objectively measurable biological event.
If we draw blood during an episode, we will find elevated cortisol, elevated adrenaline, and altered blood gas levels due to the hyperventilation.
And the provocation studies prove we can trigger this entirely mechanically. It is a profound whole-body physiological crisis, not a failure of willpower.
So, bringing all of this raw science back down to the ground, why does this specific deep dive matter for you, the listener? Because as the clinical sources emphasize, understanding this exact physiology is an intervention in itself.
When it comes to panic, accurate mechanical knowledge is literally medicine.
Knowing that your dizzy head and the terrifying tingling in your hands are just a temporary lack of carbon dioxide and absolutely not an impending stroke cuts that catastrophic cognitive loop at its source.
Yes. When you understand exactly why your body feels so weird, you strip the amygdala of its power to spiral.
That is why simple breathing and retraining, deliberately slowing your breath down to restore your normal CO2 levels, remains one of the most effective, evidence-backed tools available. You're using a mechanical action to manually override the chemistry of fear.
It is an incredibly powerful tool for regaining control. But, looking at all of this data leaves us with a deeper, slightly unsettling physiological reality to consider. We have just explored how a slight, almost imperceptible drop in blood carbon dioxide or a single misread flutter of the heart can cause our brains to manufacture an entirely convincing, terrifying life-or-death reality that feels 100% physically real.
The brain completely builds the illusion.
Exactly. It forces you to wonder if our complex neurological hardware can fabricate such an absolute physical illusion of doom from a tiny chemical shift in the blood. How much of our calm, everyday baseline reality is also just a fragile chemical illusion that we simply happen to accept as normal?
Wow. That is a phenomenal question to leave on. The mind isn't a simple machine, and when the internal alarms go off, the waters are deep, murky, and incredibly complex. But by understanding the mechanics of the alarm, we are finally learning how to navigate those waters without drowning.
Absolutely.
Thank you for exploring these sources with us and for joining us on this deep dive. Take a slow, deep breath, balance your CO2, and we'll catch you next time.